when you sit in London or in Paris or in a kind of comfortable European or Western capital, it doesn't really matter that much where the food comes from. But when you're sitting in a place where there is a kind of deep existential schism or problem, then food becomes really important.
Welcome to Unheard Confessions. My name's Giles Fraser, and this is the podcast in which we talk to well-known and interesting people and try and sit down with them and drill down into their core beliefs and work out what it is they believe and they're all on about. And today I have with me the wonderful, lovely Yotam Ottolenghi. Yotam, welcome. Very nice to see you.
Thank you.
What we normally do here is we start by talking about you and your background and where you come from, which of course is pretty fascinating. You were born in Jerusalem, is that right?
Yeah, I was born in Jerusalem in 1968. Okay. So I celebrated my 50th birthday pretty recently.
Nice and so.
And yeah, I mean, a wonderful city in so many ways. I have to say that I think I was quite lucky because I grew up in Jerusalem in the 70s and 1980s. And there was a short period in time, which I call it the naive stage of the Palestinian-Jewish relationship in the city, in which there was a sense that we might be able to live happily ever after. And I have a lot of very fond memories of the time growing up in Jerusalem.
Where was home?
I grew up in a small neighborhood in West Jerusalem called Ramat Denia, which is really not at all remarkable in any particular way. But so a year after the Six-Day War, 1967, and Jerusalem, the eastern part of Jerusalem has become under Jewish Israeli control, and alongside the rest of the West Bank. And I felt throughout my childhood that this was both a familiar and a completely exotic, wonderful place to explore. And just recently I went to Israel with my husband Carl and one of our boys. And we took a car with my parents from Jerusalem, where they live, or they live outside Jerusalem, but not too far from the city, down to the Dead Sea. And then instead of turning left when we reached the Dead Sea and going to Jericho, we turned right and went to En Gedi, which is a kibbutz near on the Dead Sea. And this reminded me of a bike ride we used to take. My dad, my younger brother, and myself would take our bicycles. And literally, we didn't even have to pedal one time because Jerusalem is 800 meters high and the Dead Sea is 300 meters below sea level. We just used to literally ride down the hill all the way from Jerusalem to Jericho.
You did not?
Yeah,
wow.
On our bicycles. I was probably 10 or 11, my brother was 8, and we just literally cycled all the way down.
How did you get back, by the way? Because it's a hell of a hill.
No, so my mom used to come back and pick us up in a car. We'd load the bikes back on our car and go back. But getting to Jericho by bicycle, it was such a naive, as I said, period. Very, beautiful before all the consequences of the occupation have raised their heads, and you could see literally an unspoiled, beautiful desert with Bedouins and tremendous food when you reach Jericho. Really fragrant, because Jericho is so low underneath sea level. It's very warm and humid, so it's almost like tropical. They grow wonderful citrus oranges and beautiful, salads and vegetables and meats, and the flowering in the spring of all the flowers that grow around there, because it's a kind of a it's at the bottom of the Jordan River, or along the Jordan River, so it's pretty fertile as well.
When you go down that hill, it feels like the whole world is opening up before you, doesn't it? I mean, it's just extraordinary to see the Valley
oasis and all the date trees, and it's incredibly beautiful. And when you reach there, you can literally spend a whole day just enjoying those wonderful smells, and it's so sensual. It's salty and it's sweet and it's perfumed like this. The smells. It was really wonderful. So growing up in Jerusalem with the West Bank, we used to go to Bethlehem and Jericho and Ramallah and all these places that are completely cordoned off now. It was wonderful, and it was a great period.
So tell me about your mum and dad and
my parents were. My dad was a university professor. He was a chemistry professor, and my mom was a maths teacher and then a head teacher. So they were kind of very academically orientated, and that's the household I grew up in. My mom was kind of an institution in Jerusalem. She was a headmistress at a big high school, which was bad and good in equal measure. So honestly, she was quite controversial because she was very strict, and I got the hard end of the stick with many kids. I didn't go to her school, but I had friends that went to her school, so it wasn't always easy. But on the other hand, I felt that I grew up spoiled for inspiration in terms of my education and my academic life.
So it's quite a bookish sort of household.
Yeah, quite a bookish, quite scientific as well.
Okay.
And I felt. I actually, before I went to university, I majored at high school. I studied physics and mathematics, but it's not something that I enjoyed. But it was definitely part of our house, the style at home. But yeah, it was great. I mean, it's a very middle class with all the advantages that come off.
Did they come to Israel? Did they themselves come to Israel? Did they make Aliyah? Or
my parents arrived in Palestine in 1939. From Europe as children, so they were very young. They were 4 years old. They happened to arrive at the same time, the same year, the same age, but obviously not together.
From Italy?
My dad is from Italy, and my mother is from Germany.
Oh, okay.
So two different Jewish diasporas, but yeah, they arrived at the same year they happened. And they met at university in Jerusalem in the 1950s. And married and had my older sister, myself, and my younger brother. We were kind of children of born somewhere between the early 60s.
Were they sort of
and
liberal,
the early 70s.
Or they're sort of like...
They were very liberal, yeah.
Okay.
Very
they weren't
liberal.
religious?
No, my parents were very non-religious in so many ways. And we grew up in a very agnostic household. So religion was kind of not something...
So it's a part of that sort of secular... Zionist sort of...
Very secular. I mean, actually, my parents come from different backgrounds. On my dad's side, they were actually they were Zionists, but they were actually quite traditional and a wee bit orthodox. I mean, not a lot, but they were a very educated European household. But they were keeping kosher at home, etc.
Okay.
But my mum's side is kind of completely the opposite. My mom was buying pork under the counter in Jerusalem in the 1970s.
I bought pork under the counter with my mother-in-law. It's quite a thing, isn't it? Going to buy bacon in Tel Aviv.
It is.
It's like buying things in sort of little brown envelopes.
It was even more so in the Jerusalem of the 1970s. And the one thing I would never forget, I wrote about it in the book Jerusalem, my cookbook. And I said, we used to get those ham sandwiches for school, but my mom made my siblings and myself promise we'd tell everybody that we were having turkey sandwiches, and this was the pinkest turkey I've ever seen. So yeah, but there is something about in Israel. Every possible decision has huge implications about lots of other things that people that don't live in Israel don't really understand. So the decision about what you're going to eat or what you're not going to eat, or whether you're going to go to synagogue or not going to synagogue, has huge implications about your political positioning and where we are. We were quite a lefty house, and as a result, we couldn't be really that kind of religious. I mean, I'm drawing a very
Did you do high days and holidays and that sort of thing, or did you do Friday night?
We didn't do any Friday night dinners, but we did. The only thing we really did was the Passover meal, when we used to go to my Italian grandmother. They were kind of the traditional side and do a proper Seder. But yeah, we were very unorthodox, and my parents still are. Which Jews in Britain don't really understand that concept totally. I mean, the fact that I eat pork, it raises so many eyebrows. But it's just the way I grew up, really. It was just, I mean, it's a very German Jewish thing, that kind of forcefully assimilating yourself, and then obviously with all the consequences of that came later. But
and did you have that sort of, in terms of food, those sort of secular Ashkenazi sort of, that food that comes over from Europe, where you're sort of eating basically sort of European food in cream and meatballs and things like that in the Middle East. It's crazy, really. I always think
it was insane. I will always remember my grandmother, the German grandma, was so German, and so we had every Saturday go to her house for Saturday lunch at 2 p.m. It was like clockwork, and she always cooked the same same thing, which was ox dung,
right,
braised in some kind of stock and then served with capers and which is absolutely delicious, but it was just the same. A whole boiled cauliflower with a kind of a butter bread sauce that goes on top. Also very Eastern European, quite Czech, Austro-Hungarian, which is where my grandmother comes from, and some form of cabbage.
Even you can't, even with your genius at cooking, you can't make something out of gefilte fish, can you?
I kind of perversely like gefilte fish.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. I used to always claim that I hate it, but really deep down inside, I do love the contrast between something that is sweet and something that is spicy. So if you have it, there's we're not talking about like English Jewish gefilte fish, which is fried fish balls. We're talking about the ones set in aspic.
Yes.
And if you have that with a lot of horseradish and sugar inside, it is but officially disgusting. But actually,
I find it hard.
I can have it. I can enjoy it, but that's just because I'm greedy.
So you have this. I understand a bit about your sort of family and school, and then there's a sort of academic expectation, I imagine, from that sort of family, and you go on to university.
Yeah, I never really questioned whether I'm going to go to university or not. Going to university was just a given, and I went to Tel Aviv University in the early 90s, 1991 or 2.
Living at home in Jerusalem, or
no? I moved to Tel Aviv, and also I moved in with my boyfriend at the time, which was my first gay relationship. We lived in by the Carmel Market,
lovely.
And I do remember from Tel Aviv in the early 90s, it was the first time I really had to cook, because growing up in my house, my parents did the cooking, and us kids enjoyed the food, and I loved my parents' cooking. Both of them are really good cooks, very different cooks, but very good cooks. And when I moved to Tel Aviv, I realized that if I don't learn how to cook, nobody will cook for me. I mean, it's a very banal realization, but it's a real truth that people who leave a home with good food find themselves struggling, because it's like, so I started going to the market and
you couldn't live on pizza.
I mean, the good thing is the street food in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem as well, has always been good, but you just want to kind of have meals like proper. And I remember going to the Carmel Market, and one of the smells that I will always remember is that fresh herbs. Because it's so hot, they're always kind of kept under cover and with lots of water like dripped, being sprayed on it. And the dill and the coriander and the tarragon and the basil and all those kind of intensely, it comes out of the mist of water and heat, which is incredibly sensual. And I will always remember those herbs. So my love of herbs, I think, has been kind of created during this time in Tel Aviv in the market, going and smelling
to a sort of Western, to a Westerner, with our sort of different. The fact that we go to Sainsbury's and so forth. You go to it feels dirty. I mean, it feels like it. Those sorts of markets. I mean, I absolutely love it. But I know Westerners will go there and think, oh my word, in this heat and so forth. But you're absolutely right about it just feels the heat makes it.
The heat makes everything smell and taste 100 times more than it does if it's refrigerated. And this is one of the things I feel I have, like this vendetta against chilling food, because I mean, we live in a society that is so risk averse in so many ways, but in how far we're going to let our food warm up before we consume it,
it's
another manifestation of that. And when you go to a market, like you say, both in Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, you see like bits of meat hanging for hours, days on, and flies on them, and they're absolutely fine if you cook them properly. But for a Western eye, it just doesn't work. And I guess I've only become sensitive to it since I moved here. But in the early days, going to the market in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem and seeing those wonderful herbs and cheeses sitting in those.
We have nothing like Karma Market or Machne Yehuda here. We have nothing like that, do we?
No, but it's because it's a living market with a heart. And when you go to market in Western Europe, but particularly Northern Europe, in particular here, they are constructs. I mean, they're great because people get into, but people have been thinking about how to create them, while those markets in the Middle East are
so
just
borough
are
market
organic.
is too overthought, is
I
it?
mean, in a sense, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but it just doesn't. It doesn't have the same function. It hasn't kind of evolved in the same way that these markets that have been around organically, and also really reflecting a way of life. Because Machne Yehuda Market in Jerusalem is somewhere where people come and buy their food. There's nowhere else to buy the food, or at least there wasn't when I was growing up. So you'd go to the fishmonger and you go to the butcher and you go to those wonderful vegetable stalls and you buy it. Especially on a Friday, it's hectic. It's so wonderful because they've got this plan. You know, the Jews and also Muslims, they have this plan to cook for the weekend, which is insane because at some point you're not allowed to cook anymore. So you actually start on a Thursday night and you build up all those dishes that are going to sit there ready to be consumed on the Saturday. And that really makes you dictates some quite heavy shopping and calculated shopping, all starting on a Thursday with all the cooking going on the Friday morning. It's so wonderful. And there's restaurants in the market, I've written about them, spoken about them, that reflect that, like Azura, which is Kurdish, Jewish, Kurdish, Turkish restaurant, where all the dishes are prepared like early in the morning or even in the middle of the night, sitting on these little fires. Sitting in their cooks, cook like stuffed meat or vegetables or a stew. And then people come in at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and have those things that have sat for hours cooking. It's a wonderful experience.
So we'll come back onto cooking. Cooking. So what did you study at university?
I studied comparative literature and philosophy.
Oh, okay.
And I was particularly interested in philosophy of art and representation in arts. So I did my MA in comparative literature in the comparative literature department, but my dissertation was about representation in photography, world representation in photography, from a very philosophical discussion about where does the image stand in relation to reality when the medium is not an artist's mind but a mechanical process like a camera, and where does the human agent come in?
Mechanical representation.
Which I kind of enjoyed, but I feel now that I go back and read. I wouldn't go back and read my dissertation even if you paid me a lot of money, but when I look at it now, it felt quite futile. It was a very what I found really weird. Like when I finished my dissertation after 1.5 or 2 years of really hard work and a lot of thinking, I printed 5 copies and gave it to my parents, to my best friends, and to my supervisor. And for the life of me, I'm sure no one has ever read them. It's like...
So there's a gap that's opening up here, I guess, with you going to the markets and, the way in which you talk about the spices and how exciting it is. And then also, but you're actually writing your dissertation. There's the emotional, appetitive, and then there's the intellectual. There's this sort of split, I guess, between...
In a way, yes. And I always felt...
Mind, body.
I do love both aspects of being, or those two aspects of being. And I've never felt that they are not related or connected. Obviously, they are. Everything is connected. But I did feel that my intellectual life was quite futile in a sense that, when it's a bit funny that saying that nobody has read it, but the conversation I felt was happening in rooms with so few people that actually understood what we were talking about. And all of a sudden, when I started cooking for people, the audience was so great and the reaction was so immediate that contrast was mind-bending. I thought, actually, I could cook a meal and get smiles on so many people's faces with such little effort that it just couldn't compare to that kind of what an intellectual life that felt very futile in a sense.
And were your parents disappointed that you sort of left the life of the mind, as it were? Not that you have, but that you, professionally speaking, and that you decided to embark on a career.
They were less
food.
disappointed and more concerned. I think at those early days, I was approaching 30. And I could become a journalist or I could become an academic in theory because I did both things and I was pretty good. And I think they were thinking that like any parent would think, especially my father voiced it in a letter that he wrote to me saying, it's absolutely fine if that's what you want to do. but I'm really worried about you getting lost in this on this journey. And he voiced it in a very generous way, and he said, do what you need to do. And I completely understand that. I'm a father now, and I've got two very young children. I've always have their best interest in my mind, but I'm not sure it's always their best interest and not mine.
Of course, you were 30 because presumably you spent 3 years in the army.
I did. I spent.
What did you do in the army?
I was in the intelligence, and I studied Arabic at school, so I used that to get a job that didn't require me to.
You weren't fighting.
Yeah, to be honest, I have always worried. From a very young age, I knew I couldn't become a fighter, and if I was going to do my military service, I had to find a way out. So it was quite calculating when I tell this to people now; they can't quite believe it. For a 12 or a 13-year-old to choose Arabic as the language, because I knew they will get me out of having to do.
Is that right?
Yeah, I was, because I was terrified of having to serve in a fighting unit.
And what about your children? I mean, I have this with my children. My wife is Israeli, as you know, and so the idea that my children, and I think, in terms of getting Israeli passports for them, and then whether they will serve in the IDF is like, do you have any? Are they going to get Israeli passports?
My children don't have Israeli passports. I wouldn't want them to serve in the Israeli army, if I'm completely honest. First of all, I don't think it will become relevant because we are so deeply rooted in our London lives that I can't see us moving there. So that kind of precludes that. But it's difficult for me to even start to imagine that. It's really not our reality. And as if someone can avoid serving in a military force in any way they can, then I always think better. I had a younger brother who was killed in an accident in the army, and he was 2 years younger than me, and he was in the IDF. He was an officer, and he was shot by what they call friendly fire in a drill.
Where was that?
That was in 1991.
When he was when he was
doing his military service, compulsory military service, and I mean that's happened, but for me that is closely naturally associated as a kind of a very live consequences of joining a military force, and I would never want if I can for my children to be there. And I don't think that that's the reason, but it's definitely something in the background that makes me think a million times, what is the justification for that? What could be?
I share all of your anxiety about my children too, but I guess more recently with so much talk about anti-Semitism and that sort of like, the sort of whether there's a new feel about anti-Semitism in Europe and this country, part of that makes me think, I'm really, really glad that my children have access to Israeli passports if they need it. It's the first time I've started to think like that.
I'm still in the much more innocent stage of it. I don't really think, but maybe I'll learn to regret. I'll learn to regret that. But I still don't feel that my kids. There's a chance they'll be unsafe here.
Do you feel a different temperature about anti-Semitism here?
Just by reading the news and listening to the radio, not in any of my experiences. But I know I live a very sheltered life in North London, where I know I'm not exposed to things that happen in other places.
But it's interesting you say that, because you're high profile, Jewish. You have exposure through your restaurants, and which is anyway, Middle Eastern, certainly food and so forth. I'm surprised that you haven't been exposed to some degree of anti-Semitism.
No, I have. I hand on heart, I haven't been exposed to it personally, and I really hope I won't be. Although I think it's probably not. It's going to happen one way or another. No, and I really have a very. I know I arrived here more than 20 years ago. And I arrived from a country where I felt the kind of the struggle and the strife so intense that I felt like I've got to go at least for a little while to kind of liberate myself extricate myself from this.
When did you leave Israel?
I left Israel in 1995, the end of 1995.
Rabin?
Yeah, like a couple of weeks after Rabin was assassinated. I would love to say that that was the reason, but it was planned a few weeks before he was assassinated. I was actually in that demonstration when he was assassinated, and
You were
in the demonstration,
Reading Square. You were in King Square.
Yeah, I was there when he was killed.
Wow.
And I used to work in Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper at the time, as a sub-editor. And I remember getting phone calls about it because we were just leaving the demonstration, because it happened at the end of the demonstration when he
walked down the stairs.
He walked down the stairs. He was giving a speech or something. And I got this phone call, and people from the news desk were calling to say, "Oh, this has happened, and you've got to come in." And it was just completely, you know, it was something that for a very long time seemed like a kind of something that couldn't really happen, like a nightmare that is not without any sense of reality to it, because you were there. I mean, I think when you hear about those things, you can put them into places in your mind, but when you're there, it just seems completely unreal. I mean, he was there 2 minutes ago. We watched him give a speech, and then we were walking down the road, and you get these phone calls. So it felt, and then the sirens and everything, but I just felt that I'm moving from a place that is very abnormal to a place which is very normal.
But I mean, you sort of, I mean, that was that assassination. I mean, Israel changed after that assassination. I mean, it became a different sort. It feels to me it became a different sort of place.
Yes, it has changed. It has changed in a very fundamental way, because, I mean, he was assassinated at a moment. I mean, we're talking about a sense of some kind of naive understanding of the reality when I was talking about the 70s, and now we're fast forwarding to 20 years, and this is the mid-90s, and this was after the peace accords have been signed with the PLO, and Arafat was shaking Rabin's hand, and the world seemed like it's going somewhere, or our world, the Middle East, and that assassination has really broken that sense of hope,
optimism,
and optimism.
Yeah.
And what followed was terrible. There was a whole half a decade, or I can't remember exactly how long, of terrible suicide attacks in Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel. The peace process completely unraveling, and since then there hasn't been any sense of similar hope within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, being here up until 2.5 years ago, have felt like a bastion of sanity, and I thought, like, I'm going to bring my children up in a place that feels like it doesn't struggle under the same level of tense struggle that you get in Israel and Palestine. But obviously, I feel a little bit less so now. But I haven't moved I haven't quite accepted that it might be the case that this will be as dangerous a place or as torn a place as Israel is. But it might. I hope not.
Oh, I hope not too. So, how do you? I understand how you got into cooking, because you're cooking for yourself when you're a student and so forth. But so you're working for Haaretz, and then you leave and you come to Europe.
I went to live in Amsterdam for a couple of years with my boyfriend at the time, and we spent 2 years. I had to finish my dissertation, so I wrote it there in an attic in Amsterdam in a very traditional.
More aesthetics.
Yeah,
more aesthetics.
More aesthetics.
Yeah.
I was listening. It was a beautiful surrounding to write my dissertation, and at the end of these 2 years, which were kind of like quite hedonistic, lots of going out, nightclubs, etc. I felt that I needed to do something with my life, and this is when I moved to London. And London seemed like a very business-minded place after Amsterdam. And I came and I took a couple of courses at the Cordon Bleu Cookery School. Not because I loved French cooking, but because I thought I needed to learn quickly some basic tools that would move me forward if I was to become a chef. And I didn't really decide to take this as a career as such at that point, but I thought this might become my career, and I started working in restaurants. I was doing a pastry work mostly in the first few years in kitchens. I worked for Rowley Lee at Kensington Place, and I worked and then I worked at the patisserie shop called Baker and Spice in Knightsbridge. So I became a pastry chef, and I loved
Walton
it.
Street, is that
Walton
the one?
Street,
I know,
yeah,
opposite Scalini's.
exactly.
I know, yes.
And I became the head pastry chef there, and I absolutely loved this. I just found I really felt like I found my place, because it was such I have a very busy mind, and it works over time, and sometimes it really exhausts me to think so much. And I felt that being completely getting the full excuse not to think, but just to work with my hands was just what I needed, and that's what I found.
After years of writing dissertations that no one's going to read, that sort of overly sort of thinking too much, that there's some sort of relief from just being entirely practical.
Entirely practical.
I get that.
Yeah, completely. And also, I felt that there's the separation between work and home I've never had. And so I used to work in a newspaper, and as soon as I got home from work, I was only working at the news desk, and so I'd finish my shift like 11, 12 o'clock at night. As soon as I got home, I'd turn on the radio. In the morning, I'd go and get the paper, look at everything, and same was university. If I was always had to read someone's article or some book, and when I used to start working in the kitchen, I felt such a relief that I finished work. That's the job's done. I could go home. I could veg. I could choose to read a book or not read a book. I could watch TV. All of a sudden, that wonderful separation between work and normal life became an option. I never knew this was a problem until I saw how the other half lives, and I loved it. I used to work at Baker and Spice. It's hard work, kitchens. You stand up for many hours, physically, but once you're done, you're done.
We had Alan Rusbridger on this on Confessions, and he was telling me that after he finished as the editor of The Guardian, it took him 2 years to work out what a human body should feel like after the adrenaline is flushed through.
Yes.
Because it was just so all-consuming, so constant, so 24 hours, and 2 years.
Yes.
For you to realise that actually what you're supposed to feel like. So I completely understand.
Completely, and it's a wonderful feeling, really. I mean, adrenaline is great. Don't get me wrong. I mean, these jobs that I used to do, I love them, but there is something really, and that's what I still find cooking gives me that sense. So I don't cook in my restaurants for quite a while now. I am in charge, but when I cook at home, I have this kind of ritual of putting some music on and going into the kitchen and cooking something completely benign. I'm not testing a recipe. I'm not cooking for anyone.
You're cooking for your loved ones.
And I do things that are really ridiculously unchallenging, like cooking a vegetable ratatouille to put in containers to freeze for my kids for the week, batch cooking. And I find it so relaxing. And I remember what it was like when I just started cooking, that sense of realization that physical activity, mindless physical activity, is really relaxing. And I think like anything else, like meditation, like a certain sport that you take on, it's just got that ability to allow you to switch, gives you the wonderful excuse to switch off without feeling any sense of guilt or anything that.
And you feel like you're doing something. And I love cooking. I mean, I do love cooking, and cooking is so bound up with the sort of very physical love that you have for other people, because I only cook for my loved ones or for the people that I like, and it's just so wrapped up in that, in the care you give. I can understand how. I mean, it's just such a wonderful.
It is the act of cooking. I thought about it recently because someone asked me. It involves things that are very mundane but great fun for me. The shopping and the preparation. They're all great things. They're quite, they're not in any well, there's nothing.
I can't imagine you going shopping, by the way. I just can't imagine someone in the supermarket seeing Yotam Ottolenghi, what he's putting in his bag.
No, I completely go shopping. I love shopping. I live on
supermarkets.
I don't go to supermarkets that much, but I go to. I've got a great vegetable store across the street from where I live, and I go and buy my vegetables there, and I come home and I cook, or the butcher, or wherever I go. I love that bit of the process, and I love the cooking. These are all very deeply intertwined. The cooking, and then the feeding is actually the best part, but they're all connected. The shopping, the cooking, and the feeding.
yes.
And we often have people over for lunch on a Sunday, and I cook maybe on a Saturday night or a little bit on a Sunday morning. And when they arrive, and you can kind of present the food.
Yeah.
I love the act of presenting the food at the table. I hate plating, like and then people. It's very functional, but they're presenting, the Ottolenghi display of food is for me a wonderful act of giving, but it's also an artistic thing. Because
Don't you miss? You talk about your vegetable shop. Don't you miss the vegetables that you can get in the Middle East when compared to our vegetables? The sort of the way the sun works on them, or whatever it is.
They're not the same, but actually we're in a really good position here. I have to say, like my vegetable shop, which is a tiny vegetable shop on Parkway in Camden. And I'm grateful every morning for the existence of this shop, and for the general recent resurgence of independent food shops, especially vegetable shops, greengrocers. Is pretty good.
Okay.
Great cauliflowers, great turnips, great potatoes, lots of European stuff that comes over from Italy. It's not bad. Yes, of course, it's not the same, but it really isn't bad. I mean, my parents live outside Jerusalem, and they have a great greengrocer, and my mum always knows what there is because she's been yesterday, and it's very limited, but great things, So courgettes in season, and aubergines in seasons, and strawberries. And I really miss that because there's very limited to work with, but actually you can become the most creative when there's a very limited range of things to cook with. So when I go and stay with them, I always go to the veg shop with her, and we shop together, which is great.
Lovely.
And then I cook with whatever they have, like wonderful apricots. Apricot season is so short. In Arabic, they say bukra fil mishmish, which means like tomorrow. Mishmish is apricot in Arabic and in Hebrew, and tomorrow is bukra. And they say, you don't know what's tomorrow going to bring because the season is so short. So it's a kind of a metaphor to just life in general.
Yeah.
And those apricots, they've got 3 weeks when they're in full season. You've got this incredible glut of apricots, and you can make your jams or your chutneys or whatever, or your dried apricots, and then it's done. And it's a wonderful thing, and you don't get that here.
No. It was in Baker and Spice that you met Sami Tamimi. That's right, isn't it? And your relationship with him is sort of interesting, obviously, because he was from Jerusalem, but from the other side of the divide, as it were. Yeah.
So Sami is a Palestinian, and we were both born in the same year, in 1968. And he went on his own journey that brought him to London. But when I met him, which was in 1999. So after having been here for a couple of years, I walked into Baker and Spice. Sami was cooking there, and I started talking to him. We hadn't known each other at the time. I was looking for a job, and we just started talking, and it was a weird and wonderful thing that we have come from the same place, have gone through so many different things in our life. He's also gay. He's spent time in Tel Aviv in the early 90s, same way as I did. But it was in Knightsbridge in 1998 and 1999 that we meet each other, and we've got so much in common, so many things.
How far away from each other did you live when you were in
I would
Jerusalem?
say...
Is he from East Jerusalem?
He's from East Jerusalem. I would say 3-4 kilometers away from each other. Really short distance.
Yeah.
And he spent way more time in kitchens than I did at that point, because he started off as a pot wash in a hotel in East Jerusalem, and climbed his way up through kitchens in Jerusalem and then Tel Aviv, and then ended up in London. I kind of started later, but apart from that, we had a kind of a really bizarrely similar trajectory, and so when we met each other, it was very easy to form a friendship, because there was just we had so much in common, and we just used to go to Old Compton Street and sit in coffee shops and chat and kind of reminisce and really enjoy the wonders of modern London and what it had to offer, and it was really, really wonderful. And this relationship has sustained us and made us creative, and and when we set up Ottolenghi, which was a partnership of more than just us. We were 4 partners, 4 active partners, but it was definitely our creative relationship and our history that has made it what it was. And I think we didn't realize it when we were doing, but when we were setting up this display of food on the counter on Ledbury Road in 2001, actually what we did, we only realize now, was kind of recreating the market, the markets we used to frequent and visit when we were kids. But when we were doing it, we didn't realize it only took 2 or 3 years for us to really understand that was what it was. We're kind of showing off our produce, in the same way.
I have a lot to be grateful to him for, because he told me when we did that Jerusalem book launch, when we remember that years ago, and he told me the right kebab shop to go to in the old city in Jerusalem. So, and it was quite difficult to find. So anyway, I found it when I was next there, and I went in, and of course it was as excellent as he said. And I just happened to say, I said, Sammy to me said, for me to come here, this is the place. Well, they were just, they said, oh my word. So every time I go in there when I go to Jerusalem, and they're always, oh, you know Sammy Tamimi. He only told me once, I only met him a few times.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is really incredible. And people have always asked us, and we talked about it, you and I spoke about it once or twice, about it was quite difficult. I mean, in a sense, people like to look at Sammy and me as a kind of poster boys of Israel-Palestinian harmony, potential harmony, and as a way out of this mess that we're in. And both Sammy and I feel a little bit uncomfortable about being in that position, because we're not there. And in the sense that it's possible, it's even very likely that the distance is what allows us to kind of keep that relationship going. Because if we were living there, there's so many pressures, there's so many issues to deal with in your daily life. And every time there is a flare-up, whether it's in Gaza or the Middle East or Jerusalem, I read about it and think, like, would we be able to survive this had we been there? We are both slightly reluctant to be taking that on.
There's a very interesting book by Amos Oz, the late Amos Oz, in which I think it's called How to Cure a Fanatic or something, some title like that, in which he starts by saying there's a sort of Western European mindset that goes, if we just take some Arabs and some Israelis and we take them out to a nice sort of place in Italy, and then they'll all like each other, and once they like each other, it'll all be solved. And he said, that's just such a naive thing.
Yeah.
Actually, the problems are structural, and it's not about people who are, Arabs and Israelis have more in common than they have with Europeans. Of course, they're likely to be friends, but actually the problems are political and structural, and it's not about whether you get on or not. And
absolutely. And I completely understand why the world would want to see it through this perspective, because it's hopeful.
Yes.
And the reality is less hopeful than that. And also food is a place where people really feel a sense of communality, and we cook. So, it's food and music and, those kind of apolitical, they're not really apolitical.
They're not, are they?
But they are perceived as apoliticals or above politics.
Hummus is not apolitical, is it?
Hummus is not when you eat it in the Middle East. No, it isn't.
Perhaps we ought to explain that. People claim it, don't they? So people claim hummus as from different sorts of...
It's the old or new question of ownership of food. I mean, when you sit in London or in Paris or in a kind of comfortable European or Western capital, it doesn't really matter that much where the food comes from. But when you're sitting in a place where there is a kind of existential, a deep existential schism or problem, then food becomes really important. And hummus is one of those, because hummus is claimed by Palestinians for all the right reasons as their national food, and so it is also claimed by Israelis for also good reasons. But when there is such a deep schism, then it becomes a real problem, and everybody wants hummus to be their own. So it creates tension and questions of ownerships that are really deep running. And I will never forget once going to this. It's on camera because I did a show about Jerusalem for the BBC quite a few years ago, and there was this man who's making hummus in East Jerusalem, and I said to him, I started asking him about the politics of hummus, and he said to me something which I found funny and disturbing in equal levels. I said to him, so what do you think about this Jews taking hummus as their own, and he said to me, "What do I care about hummus? You know, they took our land, they took our culture. Do you think I care about a plate of hummus?" And it was very profound in a sense, but also telling a lot about, you know, how deep these things go and how much the food can be, you know, slotted into this conversation and into this struggle.
Do you feel? This is a hard question, and it's unfair because, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Because, like, so in being here, not, I mean, home is here now for you, but not being where you come from. Do you feel some sense of guilt that you're not a part of that? Or?
I do. I'm not really a person that normally experiences guilt, but sometimes I feel, because I've got family back in Israel, my sister, and her kids, and my parents, I often feel that in a way I should be there with them, not out of kind of nationalistic impulse, but more by just kind of solidarity. Like, you know, they're there, they have a whole being, and they don't have a bad life, they have a good life, but their existence is much more complicated than mine. And maybe I should be there with them. It's not a realistic option, but it is something that sometimes crosses my mind.
So, food. Let's talk about food, because forget about the politics. Can you really take food from the Middle East and sort of put it into London, and does it work? I mean, can it really be done? I mean, sometimes the reason I'm asking you this is I went the other day to a well-known Israeli restaurant, not one of yours, in this country, which has it's called Palomar, you know, and it has it was a spin-off from a restaurant called Machne Yehuda near the market, and they had some of the same dishes, and I had a dish in London, which they also have in the restaurant there. It was the polenta dish, which is quite famous, and in Israel, the polenta dish comes in this sort of simple glass
Kilner jar.
That's exactly right. It comes in this, it's a simple sort of jar. And then I went to have it in Palomar, and it's in this silver, gold, grand thing. And I thought, how extraordinary. There's something got lost in translation. A little bit got lost in translation for me. Now, and it became a sort of metaphor for thinking about when I eat Israeli food. In Israel, when I eat Israeli food, which is becoming incredibly popular in London now, you know, I mean, and you were the person that made it popular. Are there problems of translation, put it that way?
Yes, there are problems, but it's not impossible. Okay. So I think I have had the same experience. So Vietnam is not my cuisine, but a few years ago I went to Vietnam with a good old friend, and we sat on the pavement and we had some of those famous pho soups that they have, you know, noodles and broth and lots of beautiful herbs. And this was one of the best culinary experiences that I've ever had. And ever since, you know, going to a Vietnamese restaurant, whether it's in London or New York or anywhere else in the world, is just not the same experience. So, but I'm glad that is the case. I'm glad that a Vietnamese bowl of soup is not quite the same here as it is on the streets of Hanoi, because why go to Hanoi then if it would have been the same? So in some ways it's good. And with Israeli food, it's the same. Of course, if you sit in the market and you have and Machne Yehuda is a market restaurant. A market restaurant is a thing in Israel. It means that the vegetables come from the market. It means that they are inspired by seasonality in a way that others just claim to be, but aren't really. It means that it comes from the cultures, especially in Jerusalem, that live around the market, the Yemeni, the Kurds, the Turks, the Persians. So it means a lot of things that it couldn't possibly mean here. So the fact that it's lost in translation, it's almost desirable.
I see.
But it doesn't mean that you don't get something which in some ways evokes some of those flavors, and it's a good thing. And look, people have hummus from a fridge, which is really terrible, a very pale, an extremely dreadful replica of the real thing in supermarkets all over in all over the world. It's fine. And then you go to Yaffo, you go to East Jerusalem, or you go to anywhere else in Palestine or Israel, and you have the real thing, and you know what it's supposed to be. So I'm fine with all that. That's just life. It's complicated.
But you're not fine with English food, are you? So you have I've heard you say some mean things about English
I have to
food.
say that it's been squeezed out of me. Actually, I do like English food.
do
Yeah, I
you?
do like English food. I just think there's a lot that it maybe isn't prepared properly. But one of my first jobs as a pastry chef in 1999 or 1988, when I worked at Lonsdale Place in Kensington, was to make Yorkshire puddings.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
because that's the job of the pastry chef traditionally in a restaurant. And I just thought that was one of the most delicious things I've
it
ever
is.
made or eaten.
Of course it is.
And it was it was a Sunday roast, and there was a roast lamb and beef and some pork dish, and there was those wonderful vegetables that were prepared carefully and beautifully, and there was the horseradish sauce and the bread sauce. And I just thought, this is a thing of wonder. It's absolutely delicious. I've had a lot of bad British food since, but I think the basis is very good. And desserts are some of the best. I prefer British desserts to French desserts because they're so more real. Taking beautiful things and putting them in a bowl and calling it a trifle or a mess or whatever it is. It's just so much more up my street than complicated French desserts with lots of gelatine. So I really have no problem with British food. I've actually found a lot of inspiration in British food, but there was also a lot of bad things around, and I do think that it's often when you go somewhere which does things without thought, then you do get bad food. But I have to say that you get that all over the world.
And is there a difference between metropolitan areas or perhaps even London? So, I mean, the restaurant scene in London is so buzzy and vibrant and so forth. And is that replicated in other parts of England?
That's replicated, but again, that is a worldwide phenomenon. You get really good food in the metropolis, and then you get not quite good food out. But I really think that what you were describing about the Israel Experience restaurant outside Israel is something that the world has become a smaller place. And as usual, there's good consequences, bad consequences to this situation. But generally speaking, I love the fact that there is a language of food that has become so international. I think most of the consequences are absolutely great. And, I've spent a lot of time on Instagram looking at what people are cooking and other means, magazines and computer screens. And this is for someone who comes from a place in the world where there's a lot of walls being erected between cultures. It's absolutely great to see that walls are coming down between cultures where there's even not a common language. And so you can see, there was this Brussels sprout craze last year or a year before that, where people were like cooking Brussels sprout. It was the hipster food of the
I didn't know that.
hipster vegetable of
I'm not a hipster.
of the moment. And I remember one time looking at this plate from an Instagrammer in Moscow cooking this roasted Brussels sprouts dish with hoisin sauce or whatever, and someone else doing something quite similar in Brooklyn or another part of the world. And I just thought, this is amazing. I mean, when you look at that, food has reached these places that it wouldn't have reached otherwise.
And yet there is a sort of there's a tension there, isn't there? So there's a tension between sort of localism, you talking about getting the vegetables with your mum, apricots, and they're only in season for a little bit, and you just go for the sort of what's there locally, and then the sort of internationalization, the fusion, and so forth. There's a tension between those two different sorts of experiences.
There is this tension, and again, it's a very dialectical kind of situation where there's a lot of good things coming out, and there's also a kind of erasing of differences, and I'm never one to want to kind of gloss over these questions, but it's very easy to yearn to go back to an era that is either has never existed or is not really relevant anymore, where things are super regional, and because even in the regions, in the places where
I fall foul a bit of that instinct.
When you go to Sicily or when you go to the Middle East, or where you see people buying packet stuff and readjusting recipes to modern day life, and you just got to learn.
Authenticity is overrated as a sort of.
It kind of doesn't really exist as much as it used to be, and we are really. That romantic attitude is really fun. People everywhere go and put a few drops of a stock cube into their sauces. Where you go to Palestine or you go to Sardinia, you go like the kind of the mama we all want to learn something from takes a bit of stock Nor stock cube and puts a few of those, and then you taste, and it's absolutely marvelous. But you hate putting it on your TV show because like, what am I gonna? I'm not going to show the rest of the world that she puts Nor cube in her divine sauce. But it's just the reality. It still has a lot of integrity, and it's still delicious, and it still reflects the way she cooks and the way she's been taught how to cook by her mom. But she adapted it. It's absolutely fine. It's just the way it is.
Yotam, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you,
Really
Giles.
good, mate. Very
Pleasure.
nice to see you, my friend. Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it, and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website unheard.com.